So, continuing in the saga of trying to understand why Rosenberg's high-dose interleukin-2 caused such systemic toxicity, really essentially creating the picture of sepsis. There was a young fellow by the name of Michael Palladino who had trained with genetic Thorbecke at NYU and then took a fellowship with Lloyd Old at Sloan Kettering and learned all about tumor necrosis factor. And then went out to California to Genentech and got a job in the molecular biology department out there. And he convinced this new biotechnology company that cytokines would be a good thing for them to look into. And ultimately, with his lobbying, he got together with a group at UCSF in San Francisco, across the bay. They did a series of experiments where they worked on the hypothesis that the high-dose interleukin-2 that Rosenberg used was actually causing the release of TNF and other pro-inflammatory cytokines. And that proved to be the case that he published then in the early 1990s. About the same time, Jerry Ritz from the Dana-Farber Cancer Center called me up, and he was a good friend of Alice Reinhardt's. He called me up and he said, Kendall, I've been doing these bone marrow transplants in my patients, and I'm losing a lot of them in the early phases after the bone marrow transplant because they have no immune response, and so they're really susceptible to serious infections. And he thought perhaps he could use interleukin-2 to boost up their immune systems. And so we embarked on a series of experiments that were performed by one of his postdocs, Michael Caligiuri, and then one of my grad students, Antonina Zhemoidzinas, to relook at the interleukin-2 receptor expression on peripheral blood cells to find out exactly, now that we knew about the beta chain, to find out which cells were expressing which chains of the IL-2 receptor. And what we found was that the beta chain was expressed by about 50% of the natural killer cells, but only 2% of the natural killer cells expressed the IL-2 receptor alpha chain. And therefore they had a much lower affinity of binding, about 100-fold in most of the natural killer cells did, than the T cells that were expressing a trimeric or bimeric IL-2 receptor. And so that went a long way towards explaining to us a little bit about what might be going on.